The Mouse Who Knew. Paul, children who read this story don't ever grow up. This is the story of a little mouse who knew that friends can achieve more together than they can by themselves. There was once a little mouse who lived in a little hole. The little hole was in a little tree, and their little tree was in a little wood. Little Mouse was very happy in his little wood. It had everything he needed. His little tree had plenty of leafy branches to keep away the sun and the rain. His little hole was warm and snuggly, the perfect place to sleep at night. And best of all, his little wood had lots of delicious things to eat whenever Little Mouse was hungry. There were nuts and berries and all sorts of fruits in the little wood. But what all the animals loved most were the juicy apples that grow on the great big apple tree, and the very largest of the all juicy apples grew on the high branches, safe from all the creatures below. Most of the time the little wood was as quiet could be, so quiet you could easily hear the gentle breeze whispering through the trees, which is why Little Mouse was so surprised when he was woken up one day by an enormous commotion just outside his little hole. Peeking out, he saw the strangest of sights. There, right in front of his little tree, were a pig and a rabbit and a goat, arguing loudly and making a terrible noise. Little Mouse could hardly hear himself think, and while they were arguing, they were all staring into the branches of Little Mouse's tree at some of the juiciest apples in the whole wood, but the apples were on a branch just too high for any of them to reach. The best way to get those apples is to climb to the tree and pull them down, one by one, said Pig. And when I do, I am going to enjoy a tasty treat. Nonsense, said Rabbit. Clearly the best way is to jump as high as possible and grab them straight off the branches. And what I'll do, I'll be the one enjoying a tasty treat. Ridiculous, said Goat. You are both wrong. Obviously, the best way is to shake the tree as hard as possible so the apple fall right to the ground. Looks like I'll be the only one enjoying a tasty treat today. Well, there's only one way to find out, said Rabbit with a twitch of his nose. We'll each have a go and see which of us gets the apples. And so Little Mouse sat in the entrance of his little hole and watched as each one took their turn. First, he watched as Pig began to climb the tree. Bit and bit Pig hauled herself upwards, inching her way up by her trotters, making breathless, oinkly noises with all the effort. She climbed higher and higher until suddenly, not actually very far from where she started, Pig got stuck. Pig couldn't move without falling because, of course, everybody knows that Pig can't climb trees. All she could do was to cling on by her trotters and stare at the juicy apples out of reach above her head. Next, Little Mouse watched as Rabbit, his big rabbity ears shaking with laughter at Pig's silence began to jump. Boing, boing, boing went Rabbit as he jumped with all his might. Little hops at first slowly getting bigger and bigger and bigger until suddenly, after a jump that wasn't actually very high at all, he fell to the ground, huffing and puffing. Rabbit was exhausted because, of course, everybody knows that rabbits can jump as high as tree. All he could do was lie back in the grass and try to catch his breath as he stared at the juicy apple out of reach above his head. Finally, Little Mouse watched as God, laughing at both of her friends for their ridiculous efforts, make her way to the tree and look a firm grip with her two front hooves. Shake, shake, shake went God as she shook the tree with all her might. But the tree was old and sturdy, and not actually long after he had started, God gave up and wobbled away. God was feeling dizzy because, of course, everybody knows that gods can't shake apples out of trees. All she could do was tumble around in the grass as she stared at his juicy apple out of reach above her head. Little Mouse watched as Giddy Goat tripped our exhausted rabbit, who was still lying in the grass catching his breath. And to top it all, Pig's trotters finally lost their grip, and she fell out of the tree and landed on top of both of them. All three were just a messy bundle of legs and movers and trotters and paws and ears, staring at the juicy apple of outreach above their heads. "It's no good," said Pig finally. "Well, never get the apple." "You're right," said Rabbit in agreement. "They're just too high." "I told you," said Gert, who was still a bit dizzy and forgetful. "It's impossible." So far none of them had noticed Little Mouse, who had been watching quietly from his little hole. So it came as quite a surprise when they heard a tiny voice say, "Excuse me, but I know how to reach those apples." "Who said that?" said Pig, jumping up in surprise. "Show yourself," said Rabbit, sniffing around for the mystery voice. "I'm still dizzy," said God, who fell over again. "Over here," said Little Mouse in tiny squeak. The three other animals followed the sound of his tiny voice until they finally spotted him, watching them intently from his little hole in the little tree. Pig oinked suspiciously. "What could a little mouse like you know about reaching apples so high?" he asked. Little Mouse thought for a moment, seizing up each of the animals in turn before she answered. Finally, he said, "If you promise to share them with me, I will tell you how to reach those juicy apples." Pig, Rabbit, and Goat huddled together and whispered to each other. They decided that since they had no apples, they had nothing to lose. They readily agreed, so Little Mouse told them his plan. "Pig, you go first. You are big and strong, and can easily support the weight of the others on your back. Come and stand by the tree beneath the apples." And so Pig took up her position directly under the juicy apple. "God, I would like you to jump on Pig's back. You are as sturdy at all, so you will help us reach those high branches." Also, God was far from convinced that this plan would work, and still felt a bit dizzy. She climbed up onto Pig's back. "And now, Rabbit, you need to hop onto God's shoulders. You are small and agile, so you will be able to reach the apples and pile them down." Little Mouse watched as Rabbit hopped onto Pig's back, then scrambled up Goat's legs and onto her shoulders. Each animal played their parts in the plan. Pig held firm, forming a strong base. Goat stood all, keeping perfectly still, and Rabbit reached high, just high enough to knock all apples off the tree, and sure enough, one by one the apples fell to the ground. Soon there was a neat pile of juicy apples on the ground, right next to the little hole in the little tree where Little Mouse sat quietly, smiling to himself. And true to their word, Pig, Goat, and Rabbit shared the apples with Little Mouse, and they all enjoyed a tasty treat, laughing together as only good friends can. They had all learned an important lesson that day. By working together, each had achieved what none of them could manage alone. And so from that day forward, they decided that they would always work together as a team and be the very best team they could be.